Story 1. The Cabinet of Perfumes. Catherine de Medici's hidden world of scents. You are stepping into the damp stone corridors of 16th century Europe, a world neither clean nor quiet. The streets of Paris reek of waste and industry. Smoke drifts endlessly from bakeries, tanneries, and household hearths, mixing with the breath of beasts and people alike. In the midst of this sensory weight, a small, elegant figure arrives from Italy. Catherine de Medici, 14 years old, carrying with her trunks of silk, manuscripts, and one cabinet ordinary to the eye, but not to history. This is not the story of Catherine's politics or her blood-stained legacy. Not yet. This is the story of the cabinet, the one that held her perfumes. The cabinet itself. The cabinet in question was modest in size but extraordinary in construction. Carved from walnut wood, dark, aromatic, and chosen for its resistance to rot, it was lined with thin sheets of lead inside to protect its contents from the shifting damp of palatial stone rooms. Its hinges were hand-forged iron, blackened not for beauty but to prevent rust. The drawers were shallow, dozens of them, each no taller than a finger, built to house tiny flasks, pouches, and glass ampoules. There are drawings in inventories. They list its compartments with an almost clinical precision. For unguents, for flower waters, for musk, for Venice turpentine, for distilled vinegars. The bottles inside were hand-blown, most likely Florentine in origin, some etched, others plain. Some were sealed with wax, others with glass stoppers wrapped in oiled cloth. You could imagine opening it. The smell would be overpowering: layers of jasmine civet, dried orange peel, frankincense resin, storax gum, bergamot oil, and rose. It would not smell like a perfume counter but like something much older, a garden, a church, and a battlefield, all in one breath. A world of odors. We often forget this. The past smelled. It was filled with powerful, persistent scents, most of them unpleasant. Body odor was ever present. Urine was used to tan leather. Chamber pots were emptied into the streets. Food spoiled quickly. Fires burned constantly. There were no deodorants, no sewers, no refrigeration. But more than that, smell was meaningful. The human body, according to the theory of humors, could be purified or poisoned by air and scent. Aromas were thought to open the pores and thus the mind. Disease, it was believed, traveled through foul air miasma. So to scent the air or the skin was a matter of life and death. For Catherine, perfume was not merely a luxury. It was a tool, medical, political, and personal. Florence, where it all began. Catherine's childhood in Florence was surrounded by apothecaries and alchemists. The Medici were among the most powerful merchant families in Europe. Their wealth came in part from textiles, yes, but also from banking and from patronage of the sciences and the arts. The Medici family understood the value of knowledge. They funded libraries and botanical gardens. Catherine grew up with access to physicians who experimented with distillation, compound medicines, and exotic imports from the East. Florence was a city of stills and pestles. Apothecaries there were licensed by the guilds, trained in Latin, and responsible not only for medicine but also for inks, paints, dyes, and scents. They understood how to extract oils from herbs, flowers, and resins using slow, careful heat. These oils were used not only to mask odors, but also to cure headaches, ease digestion, fight plague, and even, some said, to control desire. Catherine, orphaned young, was raised in convents that followed strict regimens, but even within these quiet stone walls, scent was present. Monks and nuns grew lavender, rosemary, and mint. They prepared herbal balms for the sick. Catherine would have learned to associate certain smells with cleanliness, with virtue, with healing. By the time she left Florence at age 14 to marry the future King Henry II of France, she brought with her the habits of a city steeped in apothecary science. Among her entourage was a man named René le Florentine, a perfumer. René le Florentine. René is a shadowed figure in history. We know little of his early life, except that he was Florentine like Catherine and trained in the arts of perfumery and pharmacy. When Catherine arrived in France, She brought René with her not as a nobleman or a servant, but as something between, a confidant, a craftsman, and perhaps a keeper of secrets. He established his shop near the Pont Saint-Michel in Paris and quickly became famous for his skills. His creations were subtle and precise: rose water to mask the smell of public gatherings, clove oil for toothaches, ambergris for warmth in winter, vinegar infusions for plague seasons. Catherine's cabinet was likely stocked by René. She trusted him. And in a world where perfumes and poisons were often the same thing, that trust was no small matter. Perfume as medicine. In the 16th century, perfumes were not cosmetic. They were therapeutic. Recipes for scent were included in medical texts. Consider the popular vinegar of the Four Thieves, a mixture of herbs, vinegar, and garlic, said to protect from the plague. Or Pomander's small, ornate containers filled with aromatic substances used to ward off bad air. Even gloves were scented, soaked in orange blossom water to keep the hands safe from disease. Catherine's cabinet likely included many of these items: rose oil for burns, myrrh for wounds, aniseed for digestion. These were kept alongside more luxurious elements: civet musk from Ethiopia, prized for its longevity, benzoin resin from Sumatra, used in incense and salves, and powdered iris root, a favorite base note. The overlap between healing and perfuming was complete. One could not tell where medicine ended and fragrance began. Politics in a bottle. In France, Catherine was never quite accepted. She was Italian, foreign, and in her early years politically powerless. Her marriage was strained, her influence uncertain, yet she endured. Perfume gave her a kind of soft power. It allowed her to cultivate a unique identity, refined, educated, mysterious. At court, she was said to always carry scented gloves. The gloves were popular, even fashionable, but they also allowed her to move through the crowded, unwashed spaces of royal life with grace. Some said the gloves could kill. This was not an idle rumor. The 16th century was an era of poison. Powders, tinctures, and oils were sometimes laced with arsenic, mercury, or belladonna. Because perfumes were already complex, already strange, they made an excellent hiding place. Catherine's association with Italian apothecaries and distillers, especially René, only deepened suspicion. The line between scent and death, between medicine and murder, was paper-thin. A cabinet of shadows. What does this mean for the cabinet? It was more than a box. It was a map of Catherine's world. Each compartment held a different facet of her identity. Fragrant oils and sharp vinegars, opulent musks and bitter powders, each label a glimpse into the mind of a queen who outlived her husband, ruled as regent for her sons, and maintained her hold on a hostile court for decades. And yet it was quiet. It did not shout. It was stored in private rooms, sometimes locked, often ignored. Catherine was a strategist. She understood the power of appearances, but she also understood the power of subtlety. Her cabinet reflected this. Every element inside it spoke to survival: how to remain clean in a filthy world, how to remain untouched in a crowded palace, how to remain sovereign in a land that barely wanted her. And it brings us to a curious, lingering question. An unresolved thought. Was the cabinet only a place for oils and flowers? Or was it a kind of arsenal, a carefully curated armory of the invisible tools Catherine used to navigate a dangerous court? Could a few drops of scent, chosen wisely, mean the difference between favor and suspicion, life and death? In a palace filled with whispers and alliances, where every gesture was loaded with meaning, could the quiet act of opening a drawer and selecting a vial, something that seems so simple, be one of the most calculated moves of all? You're in a royal bedchamber, dimly lit by wax tapers. Outside, the walls of the Louvre bear the marks of unrest. Guards whisper. Servants move with hesitation. France is cracking beneath the pressure of religious war. But inside, a cabinet sits quietly against the wall, unchanged in shape, but no longer simple in meaning. This is Catherine's cabinet again, and its contents have changed. No longer merely an apothecary's toolset, it now reflects a queen's evolving role in a fractured kingdom. France in the late 16th century was a country suffocating from tension. The air was heavy with more than scent. It carried the smoke of riots, the breath of fanaticism, and the sharp tang of fear. In this time, Catherine was not merely the wife of a king. She was regent, mediator, and manipulator, and in her orbit, perfume took on a political shape. The Huguenots and the Catholics. The French Wars of Religion, 1562–1598, were not simply about faith. They were also about power, inheritance, and the struggle for control. France's population was divided between Catholics and a growing Protestant group called the Huguenots. As tensions escalated, so too did suspicion. Catherine stood at the center of it all. As regent for her son, King Charles IX, she tried to position herself as a stabilizing force. But in practice, she walked a knife's edge negotiating peace one moment, suspected of scheming the next. In this context, the scents she wore and where she wore them mattered. Court protocol and the language of smell. At the French court, public appearances were scripted down to the smallest detail. The fabrics worn, the foods served, the proximity of courtiers, everything communicated rank and favor. Scent was no different. Wearing musk to a religious audience was inappropriate. It was considered too sensual, too animal. But lavender suggested cleanliness and piety. Clove hinted at exotic wealth, while myrtle oil invoked mourning. Catherine mastered this olfactory code. She shifted her scents with her roles. At diplomatic events, she might carry a pomander of sage and rosemary, medicinal, intelligent, respectable. In private audiences with powerful men, she wore subtler blends, orange blossom, iris root, and a trace of ambergris. Sweet, but not overt. Scent became part of the negotiation, a second language only the educated could detect. Even her gloves, scented by René La Florentine, acted as tools of influence. A gift of gloves from the Queen Mother was an honor, but it was also a test. Would you wear them? Would you trust them? These were not idle courtesies. Poison paranoia ran deep. The stench of poison. The cabinet became controversial. As the years wore on, Catherine's association with perfume became inseparable from rumors of poison. This wasn't entirely surprising. Distillation, the very process used for making perfumes, was also used to extract poisons. Apothecaries, especially Italian ones, were known to keep toxic ingredients alongside healing ones. Belladonna, arsenic, antimony, these were all part of the same trade. Catherine's critics, particularly Protestants, seized on this. They accused her of maintaining a laboratory of death, staffed by Italians skilled in the arts of slow murder. Her perfumes, they whispered, were not for masking odor but for masking intention. Was any of it true? It's unlikely that Catherine herself poisoned anyone directly, but she lived in a time where everyone suspected everyone else. The idea that scent could conceal poison, that a bouquet could kill, that gloves could be laced with toxins was not dismissed. It was feared. This fear became legend, and legend became history. The cabinet expands. We have no complete inventory of Catherine's cabinet from this period, but court documents, letters, and apothecary records offer glimpses. New additions appear. Styrax resin used in incense, now ground for personal sachets. Storax vinegar believed to protect against disease, now distilled in triple batches. Civet, imported from Ethiopia, increasingly used not for fragrance, but for marking documents and sealing letters, a personal signature and scent. Turpentine, not for use on skin, but kept in vials, perhaps as a solvent or something more arcane. The cabinet, originally built to hold healing ointments and flower waters, now held influence. Its contents could be used to comfort the sick, impress foreign ambassadors, or in the minds of her enemies eliminate threats. What had once been an apothecary's set of tools was now a courtier's arsenal. Perfume as propaganda. Catherine's use of scent wasn't just personal, it was performative. During religious tensions, she staged elaborate events, balls, tournaments, and feasts not to entertain, but to control narrative. At the 1572 wedding of her daughter, Marguerite de Valois, to Henry of Navarre, a Protestant, Catherine orchestrated a wedding meant to symbolize religious unity. Guests were lavished with perfumes, garlands, and fine foods. The air was heavy with celebratory fragrance. But 5 days later, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre began. Thousands of Protestants were killed in the streets of Paris. Catherine was suspected again of involvement. Her reputation darkened. The wedding's perfumes faded quickly, replaced by the acrid smell of blood and smoke. For some, the sweet scent of that wedding was the scent of betrayal. Her medicinal garden. To better control her supply of materials, Catherine established gardens near her residences, especially in the Tuileries. These gardens were planted with medicinal and aromatic herbs, tended by apothecaries under her patronage. Lavender, mint, rosemary, hyssop, marjoram, lemon balm. But these weren't leisure gardens. They were production sites, early forms of controlled supply for her cabinet. The Queen Mother, already suspected of working in shadows, now controlled not only perfumes, but the plants used to make them. It is here that we begin to understand how boring daily routines, planting, drying, infusing, were as politically important as treaties and armies. The ability to produce scent, to manage it, to distribute it, this was a kind of power. And it all came back to the cabinet. The alchemical layer. There's another detail. Catherine's cabinet might have included substances with alchemical significance. In the 16th century, the line between science and magic was blurry. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold, it was about transformation, purification, distillation of essence. Scent was part of this. The distillation of flowers into oils was symbolic, an act of drawing out purity from imperfection. Catherine consulted with astrologers and physicians who believed in these principles. She owned a collection of astrological charts and likely used planetary alignments to time her herbal preparations. Some recipes included not just ingredients but dates and hours for mixing. This wasn't irrational. It was the intellectual framework of the time. The cabinet, then, may have been more than storage. It was a laboratory of meaning, a place where scent, time, and power intersected. The cabinet's changing symbolism. By the end of her regency, Catherine was a woman shaped by survival. She had seen 3 of her sons become king. She had buried 2. She had made enemies of both Huguenots and Catholics. Her power lay not in command, but in presence and in persistence. The perfume cabinet by now had become something else. It was no longer simply a collection of vials and oils. It was a reflection of Catherine's unique form of rule, subtle, indirect, layered. She never held armies, she rarely gave speeches, but she lingered in every room. Her scent preceded her. Her gloves touched others before she did. Her gardens bloomed in silence. And yet the suspicion never vanished. Even as she aged, her figure shrinking, her influence wanting her cabinet remained a source of unease. Some said it was locked and only opened in her presence. Others said it had a false bottom, a secret drawer. Whether true or not, the mystery became part of her legend. An unresolved thought. So what are we really looking at when we examine Catherine's cabinet? Is it simply a relic of hygiene and taste in a pungent age? Or is it a coded language, a system of hidden signals, known only to those who understood the rules of court and scent and silence? Can a box of herbs and oil truly hold influence over kings and councils? Or was it Catherine's understanding of the boring, patient rituals, grinding roots, boiling water, timing a distillation that allowed her to survive where others fell? And in a world where power was so often measured in battles and blood, what does it mean if the true battlefield was lined with walnut wood and smelled faintly of violet? The year is 1589. The Queen Mother of France, Catherine de Medici, is dying. She is nearly 70, an old age by the standards of her day. Her health has declined steadily. Her power is waning. Her enemies are many. Her allies are cautious. Her cabinet, the same one she brought with her from Florence more than 5 decades earlier, remains with her, tucked in a private room within the Château de Blois. The drawers are still there. So are the jars, some open, some sealed. The walnut has darkened with time. The scent, once sharp and fresh, has grown muted, like a memory left too long in a closed room. But the story isn't finished. The final years. Catherine spent her last years surrounded by distrust. The religious wars still burned across France. Her son, Henry III, was losing control. The Catholic League opposed him. The Protestants did not trust him. And Catherine, she was weary of compromise. And yet still she endured. She continued to receive ambassadors. She continued to move through court with measured dignity. Her gloves were still perfumed. Her private chambers were still scented with herbs burned gently in bronze censers. The cabinet remained, always within reach. There is a description from one of her final audiences. It notes that the Queen Mother smelled of balm and orange water, her hands gloved, her head covered in black lace. The room was quiet. The visitors kept their distance, bowing low, and yet the presence was unmistakable. It was not youth, nor strength, nor beauty that lingered in the room. It was persistence, and the faint aroma of something both medicinal and sweet. The inventory of death. After Catherine's death, an inventory of her belongings was taken. Most of the grand items, the jewels, the tapestries, the gold, were recorded with value and disposition. But the smaller objects, especially those kept in her private rooms, were noted more quietly. Among them, a cabinet of essences, with drawers labeled in Italian and French. It included bottles of benzoin, now solidified, a vial of musk tincture, marked with a Florentine seal, pouches of orris root, long dried, jars labeled acqua di rosa, acido de set ladri, and olio di nardo, 2 small crucibles cracked, several folded papers containing powder contents unspecified, a book of handwritten recipes in a tight, angular hand, possibly hers or René. No mention was made of poisons. No secret compartments were found, and yet the rumors did not stop. The cabinet disappeared from the record after that. It was likely disassembled, its parts reused, its bottles poured out or burned. But the idea of it remained. The cabinet as memory. What Catherine left behind was not just a box of oils. It was a symbol of a type of power that few recognized in her time, but that shaped everything around her. She had never led troops. She had never stood at the head of a battlefield. She had not inspired loyalty through charisma or awe. Instead, she had moved through the chaos unseen, unsung, and yet always present. Her power was scentless to some, overpowering to others. Like the perfume she wore, it spread without effort and lingered long after she had left the room. And that is perhaps what the cabinet truly represented: the slow accumulation of influence, drop by drop, over time. Each vial was a tool, each label a plan, each drawer a chapter in a story too complex for simple telling. After Catherine, perfume in a changing world. In the decades that followed Catherine's death, the role of perfume in Europe changed. No longer bound only to medicine and mysticism, scent became commercial. The 17th century saw the rise of perfume guilds and luxury workshops in France. Louis XIV's court became famous for its fragrant excess. Grasse became the new center of European perfume production. But in all this, there was a shift. Perfume lost its dangerous edge. No longer seen as poison or medicine, it became fashion. Catherine's cabinet, had it survived, would have seemed old-fashioned, too serious, too medicinal, too heavy. The new scents were light, floral, powdered, flirtatious. Still, her influence lingered. Her association with scent gave perfume a reputation beyond mere adornment. It had been a language, a medicine, a weapon. And even in this more decorative age, the idea of the perfumed queen, the intelligent manipulator, the quiet ruler behind the scenes, that remained. The quietest war. When we look back at Catherine de Medici's life, it's easy to focus on the grand events, the massacres, the marriages, the courts, the treaties. But none of those could have happened without the smaller choices, the daily rituals, the moments when she selected a bottle, opened a drawer, rubbed a salve on her hands, or poured a little oil into water. She understood something few rulers did. That power often begins with control over the smallest things, the things others overlook, the things that seem too boring to matter. Her cabinet wasn't just about scent. It was about order in chaos, about crafting identity in a world that constantly tried to erase her, about creating a space, however small, where she could breathe, think, and act. In a world run by men with swords, she ruled with wax, linen, and lavender. A final reflection. Imagine it now. The cabinet closed for the last time, the room silent, the scent lingering. A simple object, a boring piece of furniture to most. And yet, inside it lived the survival strategy of one of Europe's most misunderstood women. It makes you wonder how many other such cabinets, drawers, or shelves changed history quietly, without ever being named. How many stories were distilled, drop by drop, into tools of endurance. And what legacies were left not in ink or stone, but in the faint, fleeting memory of a fragrance. Story 2. Salt and Storage. The slow history of European pantries. You are standing in a dark, earthen-walled pantry. It is late autumn, the last harvest is in, and the temperature has turned. Outside, the wind presses against the wooden shutters of a small manor house somewhere in 13th century England. Or perhaps it is Burgundy, or the Rhineland. It doesn't matter. The story is the same. Inside this pantry, it is quiet, cool, and most importantly dry. Wooden shelves line the walls. Baskets hang from beams overhead. In the corners sit barrels, cloth-wrapped jars, stone crocks sealed with wax or fat, and a few humble cloth sacks resting on a plank. One of those sacks is heavier than the rest. When opened, it reveals something plain, grayish, granular. Salt. This is not a tale of war or empire. This is the story of survival, of how salt, in its quiet, crystalline form, shaped everything from trade to architecture, and from law to what was served on the most ordinary of wooden tables. Salt, the silent preserver. Salt was never just salt. In the medieval world, it was life, and its presence measured, hoarded, and taxed was central to the rhythm of daily survival. Before refrigeration, before vacuum sealing or canning or pasteurization, food could spoil in days. A poor harvest could mean starvation. A spoiled cut of meat could mean disease. Without salt, food preservation was nearly impossible. Salt dried, salt cured, salt fermented. It made the difference between a feast in winter and a funeral in spring. But to understand how salt shaped Europe, you must first understand where it came from. Where salt came from. There were two main kinds of salt in medieval Europe. Sea salt, harvested by evaporating seawater in shallow basins. Rock salt, mined from underground deposits, often from ancient seabeds. Sea salt was produced along coastal regions. The coastlines of France, particularly in Brittany and the Atlantic regions, saw the development of salt pans, shallow ponds where seawater was left to evaporate under the sun. In the Mediterranean, warmer climates made this easier and more productive. Rock salt, on the other hand, came from areas like Hallstatt in Austria or the mines of Wieliczka in Poland. The name Hall itself is a linguistic remnant of salt hal. in ancient languages means salt. Even salary comes from the Latin salarium, once a soldier's allowance for purchasing salt. Transporting salt was slow and expensive. It had to be kept dry. Wagons were sealed with waxed cloth or lined with straw. River routes were used whenever possible. Salt merchants often traveled under guard, not for glamour but for practicality. It was heavy, it was precious, and it had no substitute. Salt in law, the gabelle. By the late Middle Ages, the importance of salt drew the attention of kings. In France, the infamous gabelle was a tax on salt. Instituted in the 14th century, it would persist until the French Revolution. The gabelle was widely hated not only because it taxed a necessity, but because it was inconsistently applied. Some regions paid little, others paid exorbitantly. Smuggling became common. In some towns, salt inspectors gabeless could search homes for illicit salt. Arrests were made. Lives were ruined, not over gold, not over jewels, but over something that sat unnoticed on every table. Salt was more than seasoning. It was a tool of control. The pantry as infrastructure. And so we return to the pantry. The term pantry comes from the Latin panis, bread, but in reality the medieval pantry was not just for bread. It was part of a complex network of rooms in any large household. Pantry, buttery for drink, larder for meats, spicery, and cellar. Each had a function, each had a keeper. The pantry's role was to store foods that were dry, preserved, or in the process of being preserved. Salted meats, salted fish, salted cheese, salted greens in some cases. The walls were made of stone or thick clay to maintain coolness. The windows, if any, were narrow slits. Airflow was important, but too much air meant pests. Rats, flies, mold, these were the enemies. Pantry keepers took meticulous care, sweeping with bundles of dried herbs, inspecting jars, patching cracks in the plaster, ensuring lids were tight. Salt itself was stored in barrels or linen sacks, sometimes layered with straw or ash to keep it dry. It absorbed moisture, so if the air was damp, the salt would cake. Dry salt was crucial not just for cooking, but for future preservation. Preservation techniques. Salt enabled a number of preservation methods. Dry salting, covering meat or fish entirely in salt and pressing it to remove moisture. Common with pork and cod. Brining, soaking items in saltwater solution. Easier to store but prone to spoilage if improperly sealed. Salting and smoking, often done in tandem. The salt drew out moisture, the smoke added flavor and additional protection. Pickling, using a mix of salt, vinegar, and spices. Vegetables, eggs, and sometimes fruit were preserved this way. In the absence of reliable firewood or a smokehouse, salt was the more dependable tool. Entire fishing villages on the Atlantic coast existed solely to salt and dry fish for inland markets. In times of famine, these salted stocks could be life-saving. In this way, the humble pantry, stone-lined, windowless, smelling faintly of smoke and brine, was a kind of vault. It stored time. It protected against decay. It was the buffer between abundance and hunger. The role of the pantry keeper. Pantries were not self-sustaining. They required human oversight. The pantry keeper, sometimes called a pantler in larger households, was often literate, trained in basic arithmetic, and responsible for managing inventory. He, or occasionally she, especially in convents and manors without male stewards, would track how long meats had been hanging, how many sacks of salt remained, and when the last batch of beans had been brought in from the garden. There was a rhythm to it all: rotation of stores, inspection of hinges, watching for insects, and critically monitoring moisture. Too much moisture in the air and the salt clumped. Mold followed. In this way, the pantry became not only a storage space but a science lab, a place where someone had to interpret the behavior of temperature, water, air, and time. It was quiet work, unseen, uncelebrated, but without it no feast could happen, no winter could be survived. Salt in the social order. Salt was also a marker of status. The expression above the salt comes from medieval dining etiquette. A salt cellar, the vessel containing salt, was placed in the middle of the high table. Nobles and honored guests sat above the salt, closer to the host. Lesser guests sat below it. Salt cellars themselves were ornate, made of silver, carved bone, or glazed pottery. Some had lids. Others were shaped like tiny ships, lions, or towers. They were displayed not for their practicality, but as signs of wealth. To eat salted meat in winter was not unusual, but to have fresh herbs, or spiced salt, or salt from the Mediterranean, those were signs of affluence. Salt equalized survival, but it stratified luxury. A boring but critical turning point. The invention of new saltworks in the 15th century, especially in the Bay of Bergneuf and the salt marshes of Guérande, marked a turning point. Salt production became slightly more reliable. Trade increased. Preservation methods improved. Foods that were once local, like herring or cheese, could now be stored and sent to market far away. And slowly, the shape of European diets changed. The pantry expanded. Its role grew. It became not just a space for storage, but the beating heart of a household's self-sufficiency. But no matter how wide the estate or how grand the manor, the success of the household could still hinge on one thing. Was the salt dry? An unresolved thought. We rarely think of salt today. It's cheap, abundant, and nearly invisible in modern life. But in the medieval world, it was the quiet architect of survival. And so one wonders how many historical events, treaties, or migrations were influenced not by swords or kings, but by the need to keep meat from spoiling. How many battles were lost because supplies went bad? How many winters endured because a pantry, cool and silent, held one extra barrel of salt? And if the pantry was the nervous system of a household, was the salt its pulse? The pantry is often overlooked in the histories of castles, monasteries, and manor houses. Grand halls are studied for their symbolism, chapels for their frescoes, kitchens for their innovation, but pantries, they were quiet spaces, low-ceilinged, dimly lit, built for function rather than display. And yet, they were among the most critical architectural features in a household. They determined how long food could last, how diets evolved, and even how homes were designed. Today, you step inside one. Entering the pantry, you move through a thick wooden door into a space cooler than the hallway you left. The walls are stone not just for durability, but to moderate temperature. The ceiling is low to prevent warm air from rising. Small slits in the walls allow for faint cross-ventilation without inviting in rain, wind, or rodents. There are no windows, no fires, no fragrance. The air smells faintly of dry grain, wax, and the acidic tang of old vinegar. The only sound is your own breath and the soft creak of floorboards under centuries of dust. You are in a space built to resist change, a sanctuary from rot, heat, moisture, and time. The architecture of preservation. From the 12th to the 16th centuries, the design of homes, especially noble or religious ones, was built around function-specific storage rooms. Each had a role. Pantry, from Latin panis, for storing dry foods, breads, and salted items. Larder, from Old French lardier, for meats and animal fats, usually cooler, sometimes semi-subterranean. Buttery, from Old English butter, for ale, wine, and sometimes dairy. Spicery, for dried spices and valuable seasonings. Cellar, for bulk storage, often underground. Each of these rooms had to manage a different relationship with time and temperature. The pantry, in particular, was where planning happened. It required routine, rotation of goods, checks for spoilage. The architecture reflected this slow, predictable rhythm. Walls were sometimes plastered with lime to deter pests. Floors were swept daily. Racks were built from oak or ash to avoid splintering. Barrels were rotated not just physically, but by date. food close to expiration was placed in easier reach. This, too, is a kind of survival strategy. Climate and construction. Climate-shaped pantry design across Europe. In Northern Europe, where temperatures were lower and humidity high, pantries were often internal, built into the core of a house to insulate them from wet air. These pantries emphasized air circulation, often using small vents carved through walls to keep the air from stagnating. In Southern Europe, particularly in Italy and Spain, pantries were placed on the shaded side of the home. Walls were thick, sometimes made with a mixture of clay and straw for insulation. In wealthier homes, ceramic tiles lined pantry walls to reflect heat and aid cleanliness. In monasteries, pantries were designed with theological rigor. Everything had a place. Inventory was written in Latin. Salted fish, critical for religious fasting days, was stacked precisely. Food waste was minimized, and silence was enforced. The pantry and the monastery. Perhaps no institution took food storage more seriously than the medieval monastery. Monasteries were not only spiritual centers, they were agricultural hubs, educational centers, and logistical machines. Their survival depended on planning that stretched not just weeks, but seasons ahead. A pantry here was not a mere storeroom. It was a calendar in stone. Benedictine monasteries, for instance, adhered to strict routines. Meals were modest but consistent. Fish had to be preserved, bread baked regularly, wine stored carefully. Every item in the pantry had to last, be counted, and be accounted for. They developed ingenious techniques, hanging baskets from ceiling beams to keep them from rodents, digging cold pits in floors to store cheese or butter, and marking barrels with symbols indicating fill dates, an intended use, essentially an early inventory system. These techniques would influence the design of noble household for centuries. The noble household, pantry as power. In the manors and castles of nobility, pantries became a matter of prestige as well as practicality. Wealth was shown not just in how much food was eaten, but in how much could be stored. The ability to maintain a pantry that held through winter and into the next was a display of land management, peasant labor, and foresight. Inventories of noble homes from the 15th century list quantities of food that seem staggering today. 6 barrels of salted eel. 38 cheeses wax sealed dated June. 10 stone of barley flour covered in linen. 1 sack of Spanish salt for fish. Pantry keepers became minor officials. Their names appear in household ledgers. Some were granted seals of office, others small rooms of their own. What is remarkable is not their power but their method. Boring, repetitive, careful work. Checking wax seals, listening for the sound of insects in wood, brushing dust from the tops of jars. It was mundane, and it made all the difference. Materials of preservation. What the pantry held was only half the story. How it held things the materials used was just as important. Barrels, usually oak, bound in iron hoops, used for everything from salted meats to dried beans. Stoneware crocks, thick and neutral, used for pickling and dairy. Glass jars, rare in earlier centuries, more common by the 15th century, sealed with wax or pig's bladder. Cloth sacks for grains, beans, flour, made of flax or coarse linen. Animal fat, rendered and poured over food in jars to seal out air. Even something as seemingly dull as beeswax was critical. It was used to seal jars, coat cloth wraps, or plug holes in lids. In some homes it was recycled and remelted each season. And everywhere always was salt. Sprinkled, rubbed, layered, poured. It protected, it purified, it persisted. The seasonal rhythm. The pantry followed the calendar of the year. Spring, time of inspection. Remaining stores were checked for spoilage. Jars were refilled with early greens, herbs, or dairy-based preserves. Summer, pickling began. Early harvests of beans, cucumbers, and root vegetables were prepared for storage. Autumn, the great push: salting of meats, curing of hams, grinding of grains, drying of fruit, the pantry swelled. Winter, the test: each day a calculated withdrawal. The keeper watched levels fall, hoping they would last until the thaw. This rhythm was known not by clock or bell, but by touch, smell, and habit. When the pantry failed, sometimes despite care, the pantry failed. A warm winter could spoil salt pork. A cracked jar might let in mold. A shipment of salt could be delayed by war or flood. These were not just inconveniences, they were disasters. In some communities, pantry failures led to famine. In others, they meant lean seasons, marked by poorer health, stunted growth in children, and lower birth rates. Food security wasn't about what you planted, it was about what you could preserve. And the pantry was the fragile barrier between plenty and hunger. An unresolved thought. We often think of architecture as grand, monumental, or symbolic. But what if the most important rooms were the smallest ones? What if the shape of survival was not a castle tower or a cathedral spire but a barrel in a corner, a jar sealed with wax, a stone room that stayed cool all year long? What else might have quietly changed the course of history, simply by being preserved one season longer than expected? The year is now 1650. You are standing in a very different kind of pantry. The walls are still thick, the light is still dim, but the smells have changed. Instead of the sharp tang of brine and vinegar, you detect something new, warm, sweet, unfamiliar. A jar of nutmeg, a packet of cinnamon, dried orange peel, cloves, mace. The salted hams remain in the corner, the pickled turnips still line the shelves, but something has shifted. This pantry is no longer just a stronghold against spoilage. It is a place of luxury, flavor, and choice, and the changes are only beginning. The arrival of the spice trade. By the 16th and 17th centuries, European ships were reaching farther than ever before. Trade routes opened across the Indian Ocean, down the African coasts, and across the Atlantic. With these voyages came goods that would slowly change the meaning of storage and preservation. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg and mace from Banda, sugar from the Caribbean. Salt, of course, remained essential, but these new ingredients introduced possibility, not just preservation, but preference. People began not only to keep food longer, but to make it taste better. The pantry began to evolve. From salt to sugar. One of the most significant shifts came with the rise of sugar as a preservative. Though expensive at first, sugar grew more available due to plantations in the New World at a terrible cost, built on the backs of enslaved laborers. By the late 1600s, sugar preservation became common in noble and merchant households. Candied fruit, stored in glazed ceramic pots. Jams and conserves, sealed with wax or cloth. Sweet syrups, used for preserving flowers and herbs. Sugar, like salt, was a barrier against decay, but where salt drew moisture out, sugar bound it in. The result: softer textures, sweeter tastes, and a new category of preserved goods that did not just endure but enticed. The pantry, once defensive, became aspirational. The apothecary influence. In this era, apothecaries still managed preservation, but now with a growing focus on refinement. The line between medicine and food blurred further. Recipes for preserved rose petals appeared in both cookbooks and herbals. Syrups made from violets or orange blossoms were prescribed for coughs, but also served to guests. The pantry became a hybrid space, a place where the culinary met the medical, where scientific thought touched domestic life. People experimented. Sugar and vinegar were mixed to pickle cherries. Salt was used in combination with wine to cure sausages. Cinnamon was added to brine, not just for taste, but for supposed health benefits. And in all of this, the organization of the pantry shifted. A new kind of pantry. By the 17th century, pantries were no longer just underground stone rooms. In wealthier households, they were above ground, sometimes adjacent to the kitchen, sometimes separate entirely. Shelves were built higher with labels. Drawers were included for herbs. Glass jars appeared more frequently, often imported or hand-blown locally. You might find a shelf for dried citrus peel, arranged in cloth pouches. Drawers for dried herbs, including sage, hyssop, and thyme. Jars of preserved rose petals, sweet and faintly medicinal. Bottles of distilled waters, rose water, orange water, and elderflower tonic. These were not kept solely for survival. They were used to demonstrate knowledge, offer hospitality, and express status. The pantry became a reflection of the householder's taste and education, not just their preparedness. Scientific curiosity and storage innovation. The Enlightenment brought with it a new interest in methods, experiments, and record keeping. Pantry keepers in noble households began keeping ledgers. How long could a jar of gooseberries last if layered in sugar versus vinegar? Would dried plums keep longer if sealed with beeswax or lard? We find recipes in 17th century household books that note gooseberries laid in dry sugar and kept sealed in wax glass, held for 6 months without complaint. Or eggs turned weekly and laid in lime water, lasted through the winter with no corruption. Experiments were humble but consistent, and they laid the groundwork for later developments: canning, vacuum sealing, refrigeration. In this sense, the pantry was a kind of proto-laboratory long before such a term existed. Rise of the butler's pantry. By the 18th century, in grand houses, a new term appeared: the butler's pantry. This space served a slightly different function. It stored tableware, linen, and increasingly preserved delicacies. While the original pantry remained for dry goods, this new space was for displayed storage, a curated collection of preserved treats, imported spices, and ornate vessels. Salt was still present, but now side by side with sugar, spice, and polish. And yet, for many households, especially rural ones, the old pantry persisted. With its stone walls, its dim air, and its quiet stores of salted meat, smoked fish, and dried beans. The transition was not universal. Change came slowly. Salt declined, but not its fall. Despite these evolutions, salt never disappeared. It remained in the brine that preserved butter, in the barrels of cod sent to inland markets, in the hams cured over long winters, in the table rituals of every household, whether noble or peasant. It may have lost its singularity, but it had earned its permanence. And even as new techniques emerged, such as ice storage in the 18th century, or early mechanical refrigeration in the 19th, salt remained the reliable fallback. Cheap, durable, predictable. A substance you could trust when all else failed. The end of an era. By the early 1800s, the meaning of the pantry had shifted entirely. It was no longer a fortress against starvation. It was a symbol of abundance. The room that had once been silent and cold was now carefully painted, cataloged, and integrated into domestic design. You might open the door to find shelves of preserves labeled in elegant script, imported tea wrapped in paper, glass jars of pickled onions layered like jewels, sacks of flour, yes, but also chocolate, coffee, rice, pepper, and nutmeg. Salt, too, in its square blue tin, no longer kept in barrels but in modest boxes or ceramic pots. And yet the logic of preservation remained. At the heart of the pantry, behind the glass and spice, was still the same core question. How do we keep what we need? How do we endure the season ahead? How do we make the most of what the earth gives us before time takes it away? A final reflection. The pantry began as a stone box, a shield, a strategy. It became a map of trade routes, a reflection of empire, a laboratory for the curious. And today it is often no more than a cupboard, a shelf, a repurposed closet. But perhaps there is still something to learn from its long, slow evolution. From salt to sugar, from survival to surplus, the pantry has always been about resilience, about the tension between need and abundance, about the human desire not only to live but to last. And so, the next time you open a jar, or label a date on a container, or wipe dust from a shelf, pause for a moment. You are participating in an ancient ritual, a quiet lineage of boring, essential work. And maybe, just maybe, history lives on your shelf. Story 3. 1,000 Candles, the long life of wax in the medieval court. Imagine standing in a room in a stone castle at night. The torches are out. The hearth is low. The corridors are dark. The moon offers only a pale outline through narrow glassless windows. Now imagine someone brings a candle. Its glow is not bright, not dazzling, just enough to see the table, the fold of a sleeve, the edge of a page. It flickers. The wax melts slowly. The air smells faintly of honey, maybe tallow, but this single candle changes everything. In the medieval world, light was not a constant. It was precious. It was labor-intensive. It was expensive. And most often it came from wax. This is the story of that wax, not the ceremonial kind, not the mythic or romantic version, but the slow, practical, deeply boring story of how candles were made, stored, counted, and used, and how this quiet commodity helped shape the rhythms of palaces, monasteries, and daily life in the centuries before electric light. Living in darkness. We forget how dark the past was. In medieval Europe, nightfall was not something you ignored. It marked a hard stop to most activities. Without street lamps, without light switches, the day was dictated by the sun, and work was shaped around its coming and going. For the poor, tallow candles made from animal fat offered some illumination, but burned with a sooty, smoky flame. For the wealthy and the devout, beeswax candles were the gold standard. They burned brighter, smelled better, and left less residue. But they were expensive. Beeswax was not mass-produced. It had to be gathered carefully from hives often kept in woven skeps or wooden boxes. The wax was melted, strained, and poured or dipped to make candles. The process took time, labor, and bees, a lot of bees. To keep even one castle lit with beeswax through a winter was a logistical challenge. The candle inventory. Large households, especially royal courts and monasteries, kept strict inventories of candles. In 13th century England, for example, the royal household might require tens of thousands of candles annually. They were stored carefully in chests lined with linen and straw to prevent melting or bending. Stone rooms, sometimes referred to as candle chambers or light closets, usually kept on the north side of a structure to stay cool. Clay jars, used for storing wax trimmings or partially melted ends for reuse. Inventories would track not just how many candles were received, but how many inches they had burned during a feast or ceremony. In some monasteries, time was measured by how long a certain candle took to burn, a candle clock of sorts. Candle making, the process. The making of beeswax candles was repetitive, subtle work. Harvesting wax, hives were smoked to sedate the bees. Honey was removed and the remaining comb was melted in boiling water. Impurities rose or sank and were skimmed off. Straining, wax was passed through cloth, sometimes linen, sometimes fine mesh, to remove fragments of honeycomb and debris. Forming candles, two primary methods were used. Dipping, wicks were dipped repeatedly in melted wax, layer by layer, then hung to cool. Pouring, wax was poured into cylindrical molds usually made of wood, clay, or later metal. Trimming and finishing. Once cooled, candles were trimmed for even burning and the base was flattened for standing. No part of the process was rushed. Impurities led to sputtering flames. Uneven dipping led to crooked candles. Everything had to be measured and repeated, sometimes hundreds of times a day. Who made the candles? In noble households, candle making might be outsourced to gilded chandlers, professional candle makers often licensed by the city or region. In monasteries, it was a domestic art performed by lay brothers or servants, especially in Benedictine communities where self-sufficiency was central. Candle making was part of the monastic year, aligned with honey harvests and the liturgical calendar. In both cases, it was considered low-status work, despite its central importance. And yet a single mistake, bad wax, a weak wick, a candle that dripped too fast could ruin a dinner, a vigil, or a manuscript session. The candle as timekeeper. Candles weren't just light, they were clocks. In a time before mechanical timepieces were widespread, certain candles were measured so precisely that they could act as markers of hours. For example, the night candle, a candle designed to burn exactly 8 hours, used by monks to schedule prayers. Hour candles, notched to show the passage of 30 or 60 minutes. This made candle making a matter of trust. If the candle ran short, a vigil might end too soon. If it burned long, the rhythm of prayer or sleep could be thrown off. Even in legal contracts, some clauses stipulated that such action will occur within one candle's length, or that someone would remain on guard for the burning of a full candle. Time was wax, and wax was life. The storage of light. We often speak of storing grain, storing wine, storing salt. But in medieval courts and monasteries, light had to be stored too. A full year's candle supply might be produced over a single season and kept until the next harvest. This required careful planning. Candles had to be protected from heat in summer. They had to be guarded against rodents, who chewed the wax and the flax wicks. They had to be rotated and inspected, as wax aged, cracked, or sagged. Some institutions stored candles in sealed barrels. Others kept them in long wooden racks, and every melted stub called a candle end was saved, melted down, and recast. Nothing was wasted. Wax and ritual. Candlelight was essential for rituals, especially religious ones. In churches and monasteries, candles burned at every altar, symbolizing divine presence. Special beeswax candles, known as Paschal candles, were blessed and lit only during Easter. Processional candles were mounted on poles and carried through the nave during major feasts. These were not casual flames. The church taught that beeswax symbolized purity, the wick symbolized the soul, and the flame symbolized Christ. It's no wonder that in some monasteries, only candles of pure beeswax could be used in the choir or the altar. A poorly made candle wasn't just a nuisance, it was an interruption of sacred time. Wax is wealth. Beeswax was costly, and like salt, it was subject to regional taxes, tithes, and monopolies. In some places, peasants were required to render part of their rent in wax. In others, towns had fixed tariffs for how many candles could be purchased or sold in a given season. The nobility might keep wax candles for public feasts but revert to cheaper tallow candles made from sheep or cow fat for servants' quarters. The difference was obvious. Tallow stank, smoked, and drooped in heat. So if you entered a room lit by beeswax, you knew it was a room of importance. And so, the question of where candles were burned, and by whom, became a subtle map of power. A candle's final flicker. A single beeswax candle burned slowly, perhaps 6 to 8 hours, depending on width. But in a great hall during a winter feast, dozens might be lit. Imagine the cost. A feast might require 400 candles, each meticulously placed in sconces, chandeliers, and candlesticks. Servants would trim the wicks, collect the drips, and replace the ones that faltered. When the night ended, the candles were collected, counted, Rewrapped, stored again. Nothing wasted, always recorded, always planned. An unresolved thought. We don't think much about candles today. They are decorative, scented, optional. But for centuries, they were time itself, a visible measure of the hours, the seasons, and the limits of human planning. And it makes one wonder how much of history was decided not in bold light, but in the flicker of a fragile flame. What thoughts, alliances, prayers, or revelations emerged not beneath sunlight, but by the patient burn of wax melting slowly in silence, moment by moment. The candle burns quietly in the dark. But long before its wick is lit and its flame begins to dance, it has already passed through forests, monasteries, kitchens, and counting houses. It has been gathered, melted, strained, weighed, and blessed. Every inch of beeswax that burns in a medieval chapel or courtly banquet has traveled far both in distance and through human hands. This section follows the wax itself, the long, slow journey of a substance so simple in appearance, and yet so deeply intertwined with the machinery of medieval life. The bees. It begins, of course, with the bees. In medieval Europe, beekeeping was both a rural craft and a semi-sacred duty. Bees were not merely useful, they were seen as orderly, industrious, and harmonious. The church often likened the behavior of bees to that of monks: silent, disciplined, productive. Bees provided two essential resources. Honey, the primary sweetener in Europe before the widespread use of sugar. Beeswax, the base for candle, sealing wax, salves, and even pigments. Beehives, often called skeps, were made from coiled straw, bound with twine and shaped like domes. They were placed near gardens, orchards, or the edges of fields. The best keepers understood the rhythms of flowering seasons and the moods of bees. To harvest the wax, the keepers often killed the colony, especially in older practices. The entire hive was removed, the honey drained, and the remaining waxy comb melted down. In later centuries, more sustainable methods developed, such as removing only outer combs, but in the early and high medieval periods, wax was harvested with finality. Melting and purifying. The raw wax taken from hives was dark and sticky, filled with impurities, bits of honey, dead bees, pollen, wood. It had to be purified. This was done by melting the wax in boiling water. Wax rises, water stays below, impurities sink or float. Skimming and straining. The liquid wax is filtered through fine cloth or mesh. Cooling into cakes. The purified wax was poured into shallow basins and allowed to harden into round or rectangular cakes or loaves. These wax cakes were soft gold, lightweight, fragrant, long-burning. They were often stamped with the seal of the producer or the monastery. A single pound of beeswax could make 2 to 4 candles, depending on width. The monastic waxworks. In monastic settings, wax production was systematized. Monasteries often had bee gardens, carefully tended areas with clover, lavender, and other nectar-producing plants. Wax cellars, cool, dry chambers for storing wax and candles. Candle workshops, simple rooms where lay brothers melted, molded, and wrapped candles. Wax was measured by weight. A single Paschal candle used at Easter could weigh up to 20 pounds and burn for days. These were crafted with ceremony, sometimes adorned with symbols or even gold leaf. Monks kept wax ledgers recording. Wax received from Brother Aelred, 16 pounds, from the lower garden 9 pounds, from peasant tithe 7 pounds. Some abbeys, such as Cluny or Sidocks, became regional centers for wax production, trading excess candles to nearby churches or noble estates. The peasants' wax. Not all wax came from monasteries. Many rural households kept a few hives, tucked into corners of gardens or mounted along barn walls. Wax from these hives was used for candles if the household could afford the time. Waterproofing leather or cloth. treating wounds or dry skin. However, in many cases, peasants were required to surrender part of their wax harvest as rent or tithe. This wax rent might be a fixed weight each season, and failure to deliver could lead to fines or worse. As a result, many peasant families relied on tallow for lighting, keeping their wax for barter or required tribute. The candle guilds. In cities, candle making became a trade unto itself. By the 13th and 14th centuries, chandlers' guilds regulated the production and sale of candles. There were often two branches: tallow chandlers, using animal fat; wax chandlers, using beeswax, usually of higher status and stricter regulation. These guilds controlled pricing, set quality standards, such as burn time and drip resistance, enforced seasonal rules, such as when candles could be sold. They also managed the aesthetics of candles. Wax had to be smooth, pale, and free of debris. Some chandlers added herbs or oils, lavender, bay, or rosemary, to enhance fragrance and burn quality. Candle shops often displayed their goods hanging in loops, 100 pale wicks draped in arcs from ceiling beams. The sight was both practical and symbolic, a shop of light in a world so often dark. Transportation and trade. Wax was not immune to the rules of trade. In regions with poor honey harvests or harsh winters, beeswax had to be imported. Merchants packed hardened wax into linen-wrapped bundles, stacked them in barrels or crates, and shipped them overland or by river barge. Wax was taxed by weight, recorded at toll stations, sometimes stolen in transit. Certain cities like Lubeck and the Hanseatic League became hubs for northern wax trade. Southern cities like Venice imported wax from the Balkans and eastern Mediterranean. Royal courts might negotiate exclusive wax contracts, ensuring supply for ceremonies, feasts, and religious obligations. For something that burned so quietly, wax moved across Europe like a currency of light. Wax in the ledger. Royal records offer remarkable details. For instance, the 14th century English royal accounts note: for the household of the Queen, 1,200 wax candles, each of 12 inches, for the season of Advent, received from the chandlery of London. Or 4 pounds of beeswax, to be melted with myrrh and storax, for the altar of the chapel royal. Even funerals were measured in wax. Nobles might request that 100 candles be burned during their vigil. In wills, donations of wax candles to nearby churches were common, sometimes to be lit perpetually. And when the wax ran out, the ceremony paused. Candles and ceremony. Ceremonial life depended on predictable wax supplies. A coronation without candles, unthinkable. A midnight mass without beeswax, improper. So palaces and cathedrals maintained emergency reserves, sometimes hidden rooms filled with spare candles, kept under lock and key. In some cases, these reserves were marked with blessings, making them doubly sacred. Candles from these stores were used only in times of need: plague, siege, famine. Thus, wax became part of the kingdom's spiritual security. An unresolved thought. And so we return to the flame. A candle burns. It looks so simple, but behind its flicker lies an entire world. The hum of bees, the silence of monks, the rustle of straw in wagons, the ink of ledgers, the prayers of queens, the rules of guilds. Each candle tells a story not just of light, but of movement, of how something so small could pass through so many hands before giving off its brief, precious glow. And it makes you wonder how much of history was lit not by triumph or terror, but by the logistics of wax. The flame flickers. You're in a room of stone, once warmed by bodies, faith, and fire. The candle is burning low now. The wick curls. The wax pools at the base. A drip falls silently down its side. Outside, the world is changing, slowly, irrevocably. It is the 18th century. Wax, once the heart of illumination, is beginning to lose its place. It doesn't vanish, not yet, but it no longer stands alone. Gaslight is coming, then kerosene, and in the distance, electricity. But before the flame is extinguished, we pause to consider how this simple, quiet material wax had so thoroughly shaped the texture of medieval and early modern life. This final section explores that slow fading of the candle and what it meant not just practically, but spiritually, culturally, and symbolically. The rise of alternatives. By the 1700s, several technological developments began to change how people lit their spaces. Oil lamps were improved with glass chimneys and metal reflectors. Tallow processing became more efficient, reducing the smell and smoke. Whale oil became a new fuel source, especially in urban lighting. Gaslight, introduced in the early 19th century, began to appear in major cities. Each of these innovations was faster, brighter, more consistent. Wax candles still had their place in churches, in royal ceremonies, in the homes of the wealthy, but they were increasingly viewed as ceremonial rather than practical. What had once been a daily necessity now became a gesture of atmosphere. The candle as symbol. Even as wax declined in utility, it rose in symbolism. In art, the candle took on meanings layered with time. A burning candle represented life, fragile and brief. A snuffed candle stood for death, or the end of something. A single flame in darkness symbolized hope, devotion, or divine presence. Religious rituals continued to embrace beeswax candles for their purity and tradition. Catholic Mass still requires pure beeswax candles on the altar. Eastern Orthodox services use thin tapers, held by the faithful in long rows of glowing points. In Judaism, Shabbat candles are lit on Friday evenings, two flames to mark rest and sanctity. Even in secular life, we kept the flame. We light candles on birthday cakes, vigil altars, memorial tables. And though electric bulbs are safer, cleaner, more efficient, we still turn to wax when we want to feel something real. The decline of candle infrastructure. With electric lighting came the quiet dismantling of candle systems. Chandlers' guilds faded into history. Monastic wax workshops closed or reoriented toward honey production. Candle closets, once vital storage spaces in castles and courts, were walled over, repurposed, or forgotten. Even the language of candles' burn rate, wick quality, tallow versus wax faded from common use. Candles still existed, of course, but not as infrastructure, not as clocks, currency, or lifelines. No longer did households keep wax ledgers or store emergency barrels of tapers in cold rooms. The candle, once the measure of time itself, was now a novelty. The romance of the flame. But the candle would not disappear. Instead, it entered a new phase, romance. Writers described candlelight as soft, gentle, golden. Poets spoke of its flicker as the symbol of truth or longing. Painters, especially in the Dutch Golden Age, used candlelight to master chiaroscuro, the contrast of light and dark. Suddenly, candles were no longer just tools, they were mood. A candle at dinner. A candle at prayer. A candle during a storm. The flame became something to feel, not just to see by. In this way, wax preserved a kind of intimacy that gas and electricity could not replicate. Beeswax today. And what of the beeswax candle? It still exists. You can buy them, often hand-rolled or molded. You can still smell the faint honey scent when they burn, still feel the weight of centuries in their smooth texture. In a world of screens and speed, beeswax offers something slower, heavier, more patient. Some families keep them on altars. Some light them during power outages. Some use them in silent moments of grief or reflection. In a sense, the wax candle has returned to what it always was, a marker of the sacred. What we lost when we lost the flame. With the decline of candlelight, we lost more than logistics. We lost the awareness of time passing slowly, flame by flame. The connection to labor, how many hands touched that wick before it reached the table. The intimacy of shared darkness, punctuated by a small shared glow. The rituals of inspection, counting and planning that governed entire households and abbeys. When light became instant, we lost the pause before light, the moment of intention, of choosing to make fire, to extend day into night. Wax required commitment, it required effort, and it gave something back for it. The candle that still burns. In some corners of the world, candles never truly went away. In cathedrals, they still burn in long lines. In homes, they flicker during holidays and hurricanes. In memory, they burn for those we've lost. And even now, when we walk into a room and see a single candle lit, something ancient stirs. A kind of recognition. It says this moment matters. It says this space is not like others. It says slow down. Because light, once so scarce, once so sacred, has never entirely lost its meaning. A final reflection. 1,000 candles once lit the halls of kings, the desks of scribes, the altars of monks. They burned slowly, silently, meaningfully. They were counted, trimmed, blessed, stored, and remade. They marked hours. They marked lives. They left behind drips of wax that told their own quiet story. And now, they sit on shelves, wrapped in cellophane, labeled with scents and slogans. But the next time you light one, perhaps when the power goes out, or when you need quiet, know that you are sharing in something very old. A tradition not just of light, but of attention, of care, of a world that once revolved around flame and the precious wax that made it possible. Story 4, The Weighing Scales of Venice, Merchants and Their Ledgers. Imagine standing on the edge of the Grand Canal at dawn. The air is damp and still. Gondolas rest motionless, tied to wooden poles. The narrow streets are empty. Somewhere a bell rings a slow, even tone. The sun has not yet risen high enough to glint off the domes, but in the warehouses, men are already moving. Not shouting, not bustling, just walking steadily, lifting crates, marking figures on wax tablets or folded paper. One man inspects a set of bronze weights. Another leans over a table, calculating totals. A third pulls open the leather flap of a ledger, dips a quill in ink, and begins to write. This is the silent rhythm of commerce in 15th century Venice. Not the grand spectacle of ships arriving, not the pomp of merchant princes, but the slow, exacting world of weights, measures, and bookkeeping, the unseen infrastructure that powered an empire of trade. And today, we focus on the scales and the ledgers. Venice, a city built on trade. Venice in the late Middle Ages was more than a city, it was a machine. A maritime republic founded on precision, logistics, and accounting. Its power did not come from armies or gold mines, but from control. Control of routes, of information, and most importantly, of measurements. In Venice, nothing moved without being weighed, counted, inspected, and recorded. Spices from the Levant, wool from England, copper from Hungary, salt from Chioggia, everything passed through warehouses Findacci, where merchants and officials checked goods against entries in parchment-bound books. In this city, trade was trust, and trust was recorded in ink. The scales. Scales were the heart of Venetian trade. There were many types, but the most common were balanced scales, 2 pans suspended from a beam, weights added to one side until balance was achieved. Steelyards, a single arm with sliding weights, used for larger goods, bales of cloth, sacks of grain. Platform scales, cruder but used for bulk commodities like salt or bricks. These tools were not left to chance, they were inspected regularly by city officials known as provveditori alle biad, inspectors of provisions. Stamped with marks to indicate certification. Stored in locked chests, often alongside the standard weights. The weights themselves were standardized made of bronze or iron, shaped like bells, discs, or cubes. Each bore a seal. Some were engraved with the winged lion of Saint Mark, symbol of Venetian authority. Tampering with weights was punishable by fines or worse. The bookkeepers. Once weighed, every item was recorded in a ledger, a thick book bound in leather, filled with columns of numbers and looping Italian script. Merchants kept 2 or more ledgers. The journal, a day-by-day account of all transactions. The ledger proper, libro mastro, organized by account, client, or good. The inventory, a list of items held in storage or in transit. Entries were meticulous. 15 May 1437. Received 3 sacks of pepper, 240 liber each, total 720 liber, purchased from Niccolò de' Medici at 18 soldi per libra, stored in Fondaco dei Tedeschi, cell 12. Ink was made from gallnuts, iron salts, and wine vinegar slow to fade, hard to erase. Mistakes were crossed out once, never scratched or rubbed. The numbers mattered, but so did the appearance of the ledger. A clean, orderly book meant a trustworthy merchant. Fondaci, the merchant houses. Venice built entire buildings to handle foreign trade. The most famous were the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, for German traders, and the Fondaco dei Turchi for Levantan merchants. These weren't just inns. They were customs posts, warehouses, exchange offices, and surveillance hubs. Goods arrived, were weighed, inspected, taxed, and recorded before a single coin changed hands. In these fondaci, weights were kept behind locked cabinets. Ledgers were stored in dry rooms, safe from floods. Receipts were issued, often with wax seals. Couriers ran messages between ships and counting rooms. Here trade was not loud or chaotic. It was measured, documented, and slow. A shipment of spices might sit in storage for weeks, waiting for inspection. Cloth might be unrolled, measured, and rolled again. Grain was sifted, checked for moisture, and reweighed. The Fondaco was not a marketplace. It was a process. Trust in numbers. In a world without digital records, the ledger was everything. Disputes between merchants were settled not by witnesses, but by books. If a ledger showed payment, it had happened. If a weight had been certified, it was valid. That's why ledgers were copied, witnessed, and in some cases notarized. Important contracts were backed by public notaries, who wrote their own version into municipal archives. Some ledgers even included weather notes, the condition of sails, winds, tides. These could explain delays or spoilage and protect a merchant's reputation. Others included marginalia, tiny notes reminding the owner to pray or referencing a feast day. But all had this in common: clarity. A ledger with gaps or smudges was a liability. In Venice, reputation was written in ink. Currency and calculation. Venetian commerce used a complex system of units and currencies. Weight: libra, pound; onza, ounce; quintil, hundredweight. Currency: ducats, soldi, denarii in gold, silver, and copper. Length: braxia, arm's length, used in measuring cloth. Bookkeepers needed not only math skills, but also conversion tables. A cloth measured in braxia had to be priced in ducats, taxed by the piece, and weighed if part of a composite shipment. Some merchants carried abacus tablets, wooden boards with grooves, where pebbles or tokens represented values. Others worked from mental arithmetic, using mnemonic phrases or counting prayers. It was not uncommon for a ledger to include, by my count, 17 bales at 7 braxia per, each valued at 4 soldi per braxio. Total, 476 soldi. Tax applied, 5%. Final price, 499 soldi, 3 denarii. And that single entry might decide the profit margin of an entire voyage. an unresolved thought. So often, we think of history as loud wars, proclamations, revolutions. But perhaps the more enduring forces were silent ones, a perfectly balanced scale, a carefully inked line in a leather-bound book, the slow movement of a quill across a table at dawn. And it makes one wonder how many fortunes, borders, and decisions were shaped not by the sword, but by the weight of cloves, by columns of figures in a dark Venetian room. How much of our modern world rests on the boring, steady work of men who measured, wrote, and balanced with no audience but the page. You are now in a small study chamber, deep inside a Venetian scuola, a kind of early trade school. The walls are plain, the benches are wooden, the windows let in only thin light from the narrow street outside. But here, something powerful is unfolding. At the front of the room, a teacher slowly draws columns of numbers on a slate. To his side is a chart, rows of soldi, denari, ducati, and liber. Behind him, the students' young men, most in their teens, copy with quills, their brows furrowed in quiet concentration. These are not poets or priests. They are the next generation of Venetian merchants. Before they ever lift a crate or write in a ledger, they must first master the language of trade. Mathematics, memory, handwriting, accounting, and above all, trustworthiness. This section takes us into the education of a merchant, and how seemingly dull practices, double columns, conversion charts, scribbled notes lay the intellectual groundwork for capitalism itself. The merchant's early education. Most young Venetian merchants came from merchant families. Boys were taught to read and write from as early as age 7, not in Latin, like the sons of nobles or churchmen, but in vernacular Italian, the language of trade. Their education followed a practical pattern. Basic numeracy, arithmetic including addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Units of measure, weight, length, volume, often varying by city or region. Currencies, understanding the relationship between ducats, soldi, and denari, and how these compared to foreign coins. Letter writing, formal merchant correspondence, complete with appropriate greetings, honorifics, and sign-offs. Memory training, mental arithmetic, oral repetition, and mnemonic devices for cargo weights and prices. By age 12 or 13, promising students might begin copying actual ledgers not for legal use, but to practice layout, form, and precision. The teacher was often a former merchant himself, retired from trade but respected for his accuracy. His tools, wax tablets, ink pots, abacus boards, and years of quiet experience. The abacus school, known as abaco schools from abacus. These schools were widespread throughout Italy by the 14th and 15th centuries. Venice had several, often attached to merchant guilds or located near Fondaci. Students learned word problems related to real-world trade. For example, a merchant sells 12 rolls of wool cloth at 18 soldi per roll. He gives a discount of 5%. What is the final price? Interest calculation, essential for loans and credit exchanges. Proportional thinking, such as converting prices for goods sold in foreign markets. Ledger formatting, copying columns line by line, ensuring balance and legibility. They also memorized multiplication tables and conversion rates, often recited aloud like chants. There was little room for error. One wrong digit could mean the loss of an entire shipment's value. These schools did not teach abstract math. They taught math for merchants, the mathematics of grain, silk, pepper, salt, and risk. The rise of double-entry bookkeeping. Perhaps the most quietly revolutionary technique to emerge from this world of ink and columns was double-entry bookkeeping. First appearing in the 13th century and spreading through the Italian city-states, double-entry meant that every transaction was entered twice, once as a credit, once as a debit. This system allowed merchants to see at a glance whether their books were balanced, track obligations, debts and profits across multiple deals, manage partnerships and shared investments. An example might read, debit 30 ducats to silk purchase from Genovese broker. Credit 30 ducats from cash on hand, Fondaco de Genovese. In this method, the balance was the goal. If numbers did not align, the merchant had to go back line by line to find the error. It was slow, it was tedious, it was remarkably effective. And it was not yet universal. Venice, being a city of trade, adopted it faster than most. Other regions lagged behind, still relying on single-entry systems or oral records. But for Venetian merchants, this system became the backbone of trust. You could look at a ledger and know the story of a business, its risks, its debts, its health. Merchant apprenticeships. After basic schooling, a young merchant usually became an apprentice in a family firm or with a distant relative. He might accompany shipments to ports like Alexandria or Ragusa, sit quietly in warehouse offices, copying invoices, learn how to evaluate cloth by touch or judge olive oil by clarity, practice negotiating rates with sailors and dockhands, read letters from agents in London or Seville, summarizing their contents in neat script. At night, he might be expected to copy the day's transactions by candlelight, transcribing from rough notes into the clean ledger. These apprenticeships lasted years, and there was no formal graduation, only the gradual trust of one's employer, marked by access to more sensitive records. In time, a successful apprentice would earn his own ledger, and with it, his place in the delicate web of Venetian trade. Ethical training and reputation. Merchant schools did not ignore ethics. Teachers emphasized the importance of honesty, accuracy, and modesty in dealings. A merchant who lied about weights or overcharged a partner might gain in the short term, but risked banishment from the merchant guild or loss of credit. The true capital in Venetian trade was not cargo, it was reputation. Some Abaco textbooks included moral advice between math problems. He who keeps false books invites ruin. Trade with fairness, for gold is not heavier than honor. What is gained by deceit will be lost at sea. In a world with no insurance, no lawyers, and no safety nets, the merchant's best protection was the trust others had in his ledgers. The legacy of merchant schooling. By the end of the 15th century, Venetian-style merchant training had spread across Europe. Florentine bankers used similar systems. Hanseatic traders in the north adopted double-entry methods. Spanish and Portuguese merchants, following contact with Italian ports, began keeping fuller ledgers. Eventually, these practices gave rise to modern accounting systems, business education models, the language of finance assets, liabilities, equity, profit, loss. But it all began with quiet classrooms, patient scribes, and lines of ink drawn straight with a wooden rule. An unresolved thought. So much of modern life credit, banking, profit and loss rests on ideas that began with chalk on slate and ink on parchment. But it raises a question. How much of the world was shaped not by innovation or inspiration, but by repetition? By students copying the same numbers day after day, learning by habit, not by revelation. And if trust in trade began with how well you kept your ledger, what other forms of power might still rest in what we quietly write down, line by line, in silence? The canal is quiet again. Evening has come. A barge moored in silence. A lamplighter walks past slowly, pole in hand. In the upper room of a warehouse, one that once hummed with scribes, apprentices, and traders, a ledger lies closed. The ink has long faded. The weight of the parchment has warped its spine. There are no more bales to record. The scales are still. The ledgers are dusty. This is Venice, sometime in the 17th century. And though the buildings still stand, the empire of commerce that once pulsed through these stones is beginning to falter. In this final section, we follow the slow unraveling of the Venetian trade network, and how the very systems that once gave it dominance, its ledgers, scales, and merchant memory, became relics in a newer, faster, more expansive world. But not without leaving something behind. The waning of the Serenissima. By the late 1500s, Venice faced mounting challenges. For centuries, its strategic position between East and West had guaranteed it wealth, but now geography was losing its power. The Ottoman Empire was closing off overland routes. Portugal and Spain, with new oceanic trade routes, were bypassing Venice entirely. Dutch and English ships were rounding Africa, bringing goods directly from Asia. Venetian galleys, fast but small, could not compete with the deep hulls of carracks and flights. The fondaci were still active, but the volume was dwindling. The ledgers were quieter, pages went unfilled. Some fondaci closed their upper floors, others were repurposed for domestic storage or abandoned altogether. Venice had built its strength on intermediary trade. When goods could travel without it, the city's power began to fade, not abruptly, but steadily, quietly, like a candle running low. The ledger as archive. Even as trade diminished, the ledgers remained. They were not thrown away. Many were preserved, first out of necessity, later out of habit, and eventually out of reverence. In dusty rooms above disused warehouses, city scribes boxed them in rows. Some were transferred to civic archives, especially those involving public transactions, debts, or court decisions. By the 18th century, scholars began to study them not for financial value, but for historical knowledge. They offered commodity prices over time, notes on climate, harvests, and plague years, genealogies of merchant families, the arc of risk and reward, writ not in drama but in numerals and margins. In a sense, the Venetian ledger was no longer a tool. It had become a mirror of the past. The changing nature of commerce. As commerce grew more global, it also became more abstract. Stock markets emerged. Joint stock companies like the British and Dutch East India Companies pooled capital on a scale no Venetian firm could match. Paper currency replaced coins in many places. Insurance, speculation, and distant investment replaced personal exchange. The Venetian merchant had once known the ship captain, the dockworker, the buyer, the insurer, all in person. Now, wealth was measured in shares and securities. Ledgers persisted, but in new forms. Debellentry was adopted across Europe, standardizing commerce. Firms hired professional accountants, no longer training sons at the family desk. Governments began imposing audit systems, taxes, and fiscal bureaucracy. The merchant, once a personal actor, became an employee, a partner, or a signature. What Venice had done by hand, others now did by process. The silent contributions of the ledger world. Despite its decline, Venice gave the world something enduring. The habit of documentation that economic activity should be recorded, not remembered. The ethic of balance that wealth and debt should be tracked together to prevent delusion. The training of trust that numbers, once written properly, stood as proof in themselves. These ideas underpin not just accounting, but entire bureaucracies, legal systems, and financial institutions. Today, when a modern accountant reconciles a balance sheet or a business school student learns debellentry, they are echoing the quiet habits of a Venetian boy, seated at a wooden desk, writing by candlelight. Even our digital spreadsheets, with columns labeled debit and credit, are ghosts of those parchment folios, tied with ribbon, shelved in the backrooms of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi. Memory, loss, and legacy. Many ledgers did not survive. Fires, floods, war, and neglect took their toll, but thousands still exist, sleeping in archives from Venice to London to Istanbul. Historians pore over them to understand how goods flowed across Europe, How much pepper cost in 1489. What merchants worried about when they wrote, delayed due to wind in the Adriatic. What they find is not drama but texture, the feel of a life lived slowly, weighed carefully, and written down faithfully. These are not the records of heroes or kings. They are the records of ordinary diligence, of boring accuracy, of the belief that even the smallest shipment, the smallest number, deserved a line in ink. A final candle. You're back now at that high desk in the warehouse. The light is low. The window shutters creak. The ink has nearly dried. You draw one more line across the page, totaling the column. The numbers match. The ledger is balanced. You close the book. Outside, the canal water moves gently. Venice will go on, but the world has changed. And yet, every time a line of goods is recorded, a sum checked, a ledger opened, a small part of Venice opens with it. Not the grandeur of its palaces, not the echo of its bells, but the steady, quiet beat of its commerce. A beat not heard but read, a history not told but written, in columns, in ink, in balance. Story 5. The Bell That Measured Time, Mechanical Clocks and the Scheduling of the Medieval City. You are standing in the shadow of a bell tower. It's the 14th century. The town is modest, a walled city, stone paved, a cluster of rooftops in gray and red. Chickens cluck in a yard. A woman pours water into a trough. A boy kicks a ball of straw and twine across a dusty square. Then suddenly, from above, a chime. 1, 2, 3, perhaps 6 slow strikes. The woman looks up briefly, wipes her hands, and moves inside. A shopkeeper unlatches his door. Across the street, a priest folds a scrap of parchment and stands from his bench. The bell has rung. It is time. Not just morning, not after dawn or when the sun warms the stones, but an hour measured, struck, and shared. This is the slow beginning of something enormous, the mechanical regulation of time, and how bells, not armies or laws, began to reshape human life across cities, towns, and eventually, the modern world. This story is not about gears and cogs, though they will appear. It is about how bells shaped behavior quietly, persistently, boringly, and how the rhythm of a clock began to replace the rhythm of the sun. Before the clock, natural and liturgical time. For most of human history, time was felt, not measured. Monks followed the liturgy of the hours. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. Peasants followed the light, plowing at dawn, resting at noon, finishing before dark. Markets opened after morning mass and closed at dusk. People did not say, "Meet me at 2 p.m." They said, "After the bell," or "when the sun is halfway." This time was elastic, local, and often vague. But as cities grew, especially after the 11th century, elastic time began to strain. Guilds needed to start and end work shifts. Markets needed to open on time. Courts needed predictable hours. Churches needed to signal prayer across wider areas. The bell became essential, not just to mark events but to coordinate them. At first, these bells were rung by hand, by sacristans or tower keepers, but with larger towns came the need for something more regular, more automatic, something mechanical. The invention of the public clock. Somewhere around the early 14th century, perhaps in Milan, perhaps in England or France, came the first truly mechanical public clocks. These were large, weight-driven mechanisms using gear trains to regulate motion, escapements to release energy in a measured rhythm, drums or wheels to trigger striking mechanisms. They were not precise by today's standards, often inaccurate by 10-15 minutes per day. They had no faces, only bells, but they were consistent. For the first time, a town could hear the hours even if the sky was cloudy or the sacristan was ill. The earliest public clock in England was installed in Salisbury Cathedral around 1386. In Italy, Milan, Padua, and Venice quickly followed. The sound of the bell was no longer sacred alone. It was civic. Sound as authority. A striking feature of early public clocks was this: they did not tell time visually. They told it through sound. This was deliberate. The literate few could read manuscripts or calendars, but everyone could hear the bell. Even if you could not read, you could count the strikes. This made the bell both democratic and authoritative. When the bell rang 12 times, you knew it was noon even if you didn't own a sundial. Over time, specific bell signals were created for different purposes. Matin bell, wake up and prepare. Labor bell, start work. Market bell, gates open. Curfew bell, return home, doors shut. In many towns, it was forbidden to remain on the streets after curfew. The bell didn't just tell time, it told you how to behave. Regulating the city. By the 15th century, many towns had fully integrated the bell into civic life. Consider a day in a town like Nuremberg, Ghent, or Bologna. 6 a.m. Bell signals morning prayer and beginning of work. 9 a.m. Bell for mid-morning rest or guild assembly. 12 p.m. noon bell, workers break for food. 3 p.m. afternoon bell, resume duties. 6 p.m. evening bell, close markets. 9 p.m. curfew bell, lights out, city gates closed. Everything in between was scheduled around these sounds. This structured day allowed greater productivity in crafts and workshops, more coordination between different trades, enforcement of rules for markets, courts, and schools. People began to think not in vague intervals, but in measured hours. And slowly, without ceremony, time began to take shape. Resistance and adjustment. Not everyone embraced the mechanical clock. Farmers still worked by the sun and seasons. Some monks distrusted mechanical time, preferring the natural flow of the liturgical hours. Early clockmakers were expensive, and towns had to justify the cost. But the appeal of regularity was strong. A well-placed bell could replace a dozen town criers. It could impose order without guards. And over time, the resistance faded not with revolution, but through gradual habit. Soon, even rural churches installed small clocks. Wealthy homes kept table clocks. Nobles began collecting ornate timepieces, more for prestige than accuracy. But the cultural shift had begun. Time was no longer just felt, it was told. A curious pause. What's remarkable is how quietly this transformation occurred. No battles, no decrees, just a gradual shift from shadows to sound, from rhythm to regulation. A bell rings in the distance, and someone, somewhere, looks up not to the sky, but to the tower. What will they do next? What does the bell mean now? And how long until time begins to shape not just the day, but the mind? You are in a small stone workshop. The scent of oil, iron filings, and worn leather fills the air. Tools lie neatly along the wall: files, hammers, wheels of brass. On a bench, a man leans over a gear the size of his hand, adjusting its teeth with careful taps. By his elbow, a length of chain unwinds slowly from a drum. This is a clockmaker's shop, circa 1450. The man working is neither priest nor scholar, but in this age his work is nearly sacred. He shapes time itself. Not metaphorically, but literally. He constructs the device by which thousands of people will order their days, hear their hours, and coordinate their lives. In this section, we explore the rise of the clockmaker, the quiet diffusion of mechanical time through Europe, and how these instruments began to influence labor, governance, and thought far beyond the belfry. The art of the horologist. Clockmaking in the 14th and 15th centuries was part science, part mystery, and entirely manual. A single public clock might take months or years to construct, involving blacksmith to forge the iron frames and linkages, bell founders to cast bells that would strike audibly across a city, woodworkers to craft the housing or tower furniture, horologists, the actual clockmakers, who designed and assembled the mechanisms. The key innovation remained the Virgin foliot escapement, a horizontal bar with adjustable weights that governed the release of energy from a weight-driven gear system. Crude by modern standards, but reliable enough to strike a bell every hour or half hour. These clocks had no minute hand, many had no face. They struck and you listened. The sound of the bell, deep, metallic, repetitive, was the heartbeat of a civic organism. And behind that sound stood the craft of the clockmaker, a trade passed through apprenticeships, guarded jealously by guilds, and often employed directly by city councils. Timekeeping as municipal power. Towns began to compete for clock prestige. Strasbourg constructed an astronomical clock showing planetary positions. Lund added moving figures that emerged to strike the bell. Prague famously installed its horloge in 1410, complete with rotating saints and a mechanical rooster. But beyond the spectacle, there was a deeper motive: control. The city that controlled its hours could standardize market times, reducing disputes, schedule tax collection or military musters, set official court hours, and restrict the night. Once mechanical clocks were installed, councils would sometimes ban rival bell signals to avoid confusion. They might even send officers to check private clocks for accuracy, ensuring that all time flowed from a single, centralized source. Time became governable. And in that governance, cities began to shift from organic communities to scheduled societies. Work, labor, and the clock. Before mechanical time, labor was organized loosely. A worker might start at first light and stop when the bell rang for vespers. But with consistent hourly bells, structured shifts emerged. Guild workers clocked in at the morning bell. Apprentices were expected to labor for a set number of hours. Bakers, smiths, and weavers began timing tasks, not just days. The bell marked the start and end of labor, breaks for meals or mass, the deadline for completing a task. And in some cities, wages were tied directly to hours. The phrase "an honest day's work" began to mean a full schedule, not merely visible effort. This led to a cultural shift. Productivity became measurable. Punctuality became a virtue. Time wasting became a moral failing. The clock did not just tell the hour, it began to tell what kind of person you were. The private clock enters the home. By the late 15th century, smaller clocks became more common. At first, only noble households could afford them. A table clock was a mark of status, crafted with ornament, sometimes gilded and more decorative than accurate. These clocks had to be wound daily and kept indoors. They were often unreliable, off by several minutes per day, but they signaled something new: time awareness as a private concern. Gradually, merchants, guild leaders, and professionals acquired them. The result: people began noticing time in smaller increments. Conversations included specific hours. Diaries and journals started noting time alongside events. A wedding might now be scheduled at the 9th hour, a meeting at the stroke of 11. The bell tower was no longer the only authority. Time had entered the home. Bells and morality. Interestingly, public clocks were often associated not just with order, but with moral behavior. City sermons warned against ignoring the curfew bell, risking crime and fire; skipping the morning bell, showing laziness or impiety; working past evening, a sign of greed or disrespect for the Sabbath. The clock became a moral compass, with each bell a nudge toward good conduct. In some places, clocks were given names like La Giustizia, justice, or La Fedel, the faithful. And when a clock stopped, it was sometimes seen as a bad omen, a symbol that time itself had faltered. The clock and the body. With the rise of time regulation came a deeper change. People began to internalize the clock. They awoke not by instinct, but by habit. They measured their days not in sunlight, but in intervals. A merchant might plan his tasks. Write letters before the ninth bell. Meet with brokers before the noon strike. Count his books after the curfew. Time became compartmentalized. It influenced not just behavior but perception. The world was no longer a flow, it was a sequence. And that perception shaped how people thought about labor, virtue, and even the self. A soft repetition. So much of this transformation happened not with a shout, but a chime. Day after day, bells struck across Europe. Their tones changed by region, their names by city, but their effect was always the same: division, coordination, habit. No single clock changed history, but together they structured it. A question before the final hour. We often imagine invention as something dramatic, a flash of genius, a grand unveiling. But what if the most powerful innovations are quiet, repetitive, and slowly absorbed into life? What if the bell that rings every hour is not just reminding you of time, but teaching you what time is? And what happens when you can no longer ignore its rhythm? It is the mid-17th century. A man sits in his study by candlelight. On the table beside him lays a small object, a pocket watch, oval-shaped, finely etched, ticking faintly beneath its lid. Outside, the bells still toll, echoing from the tower of the town church, but the man does not rise at their call. He checks his own time. The world has shifted. The bell that once governed the streets, the square, the waking and sleeping of a town, is now joined and eventually replaced by the personal timepiece. The tower clock is no longer alone. Time has entered the pocket, the wrist, the pocketbook, the printout, and the punch card. In this final section, we trace how the mechanical time that once rang from towers became internalized, how it crept from city square to private desk, from shared sound to personal precision, and how, in doing so, it transformed more than just daily schedules. It reshaped the very structure of modern life. The shrinking of the clock. By the 17th century, clockmaking had advanced. The pendulum clock, invented by Christian Huygens in 1656, dramatically improved accuracy, reducing daily error to mere seconds. Soon after, sprung balance mechanisms allowed for the widespread creation of portable watches. Though still inaccurate by modern standards, they enabled a person to carry time on their body for the first time in history. This was more than a technological leap, it was a cultural one. Time was no longer tethered to the bell tower. It could be owned, consulted, and customized. The hour was portable. The bell was public, the watch was private. The sound of time gave way to the silence of precision. From shared bells to silent minutes. This transformation produced several shifts. Silence replaced sound. Where once time was told by bells ringing across towns, now it was read from dials, faces, and rotating hands. Time became visible. Early tower clocks had no faces. Now, minute and even second hands became common. Time could be seen at a glance. Time became granular. Where medieval people measured time in large intervals, morning, midday, evening, the New World broke it into minutes, even seconds. Schedules became tighter. With better measurement came greater expectations. Tasks were assigned in hours, not days. Arrivals were expected by half past the hour. Meetings began on the dot. The bell had introduced the idea of measured time. The watch made it inescapable. The disciplined society. As timekeeping spread, so too did time discipline. Factories, armies, and schools increasingly relied on rigid schedules. In 18th century textile mills, bells and whistles marked shift changes, breaks, and end-of-day exits. Soldiers drilled to minute regimented routines. Students began timetabled lessons: Latin at 9, arithmetic at 10, moral instruction at 11. Time became a framework for obedience. The philosopher Michel Foucault later described this as the emergence of the disciplinary society, one in which individuals are trained to internalize external structures. You no longer need the bell to ring. You ring it within yourself. You look at the clock, you adjust, you comply, and you believe it is your own decision. Efficiency, anxiety, and the price of precision. As time became more precise, a paradox emerged. Productivity increased. Punctuality became virtue. But anxiety grew. Where once a delay was understood as late because of the weather, it became late by 7 minutes. Where once a job took a day or two, it now took exactly 6.25 hours. Time was no longer a guide. It was a standard, and one against which people were now judged. To fall behind time was to fall behind society. Efficiency became a moral demand. To waste time was not only sloth, it was failure. This was not the bell's doing, but the bell had opened the door. Time in the modern self. By the 19th century, synchronized time became central to railroads, commerce, and empire. Railway timetables required unified regional times, leading to the creation of time zones. Telegraph systems began synchronizing clocks across vast distances. Governments began regulating work hours, school times, and legal business days. The human day became more predictable, more compressed, and more measured. Modern identity became entangled with this experience of time. We speak of deadlines, slots, downtime, rush hours. We ask people to save time, buy time, waste time, spend time. Time is treated as currency, not rhythm. And yet even now, echoes of the old bells remain. The quiet persistence of the bell. Some towers still ring the hour. The campanile in Venice. The glockenspiel in Munich. The bell towers of Oxford and Cambridge, striking their ancient notes across the cobbled streets. Often we ignore them, but sometimes, standing in an old square, we hear the chime and pause, not to check our phone or consult our watch, but simply to listen. To a sound that once structured cities, disciplined societies, and measured lives. The bell has not vanished, it has been absorbed. Even in silence, the sound remains. A closing reflection. We are told time is precious. But how did we come to measure that preciousness? What if the bell, originally a tool of coordination, became a device for control? And what if, in making time visible, audible, and ownable, we lost something of the natural, the communal, the unmeasured? Would you wake without the clock? Would your day unfold without the chime? Would the hour matter if the bell no longer rang? Story 6. The dust in the drawer, filing cabinets, and the architecture of bureaucracy. You are in an office, not a modern one with open desks, digital screens, and ergonomic chairs, but a quiet room of the early 20th century. The light is dim, filtered through slatted blinds. A clerk's shirt sleeves rolled up, hair parted cleanly, pulls open a long metal drawer. Inside, hundreds of files, brown, gray, labeled carefully in blocky handwriting. The sound is soft, paper rustling, metal sliding, labels flicking. This is the heart of the operation, not the typewriter, not the desk, not even the phone. It is the filing cabinet. In this story, we examine a tool so boring it's almost invisible, but which quietly transformed the modern world. The filing cabinet was not merely a way to store papers. It was a way to structure information, discipline labor, and give rise to the bureaucratic mind. How does one keep track of 1,000 contracts? How do you find the tax record from 1897? How do you verify a birth certificate from another city? Simple, you open a drawer. And the world is there, organized by tabs, folders, and alphabetized truth. Before the cabinet, papers in chaos. In the 18th and 19th centuries, paper was a growing force. The Industrial Revolution and mass literacy meant that more documents were being produced than ever before. Bills of sale, receipts, employee records, legal contracts, correspondence, insurance claims, land deeds. But these papers had no uniform storage. They were tied in bundles with ribbon or string, piled in pigeonholes behind desks, stacked in drawers, chests, or on open shelves, occasionally lost, misfiled, or burned by accident. There was no system beyond memory, habit, or handwritten indexes. As organizations, especially governments, corporations, and banks grew larger, this chaos became unsustainable. There was a need not just for storage but for order, and so the filing cabinet arrived. The vertical revolution. The modern filing cabinet, especially the vertical drawer design, emerged in the 1890s, particularly in the United States. Its characteristics were revolutionary in their simplicity. Vertical storage. Unlike horizontal drawers, these allowed folders to stand upright, labeled by tabs. Hanging folders. Each file could be moved, inserted, or removed without disturbing others. Standardized size. Designed to hold 8.5 x 11-inch documents, what we now call letter size. Metal construction. Durable, stackable, and able to be locked. Inventors and companies competed for patents. Many filing cabinet designs were registered between 1892 and 1910. The most famous was the Globe-Wernicke Company, which popularized modular systems that allowed offices to grow their storage as needed. Soon, the cabinet became ubiquitous. No office was complete without rows of them. The filing clerk, a new role emerges. With the cabinet came a new kind of worker, the filing clerk. This was a quiet job, but an essential one. Clerks created files. They alphabetized, labeled, and indexed. They ensured that papers were retrievable in seconds, not hours. They maintained consistency across departments and years. Filing was not glamorous, but it was central to modern administration. Some offices had entire rooms devoted to filing, rows of drawers, sliding ladders, and wheeled carts to ferry papers across departments. In 1918, the U.S. government employed more than 20,000 clerks just to manage paper. Filing was not just about storing information. It was about maintaining continuity. Without it, an office could forget what it had promised. A bank could lose track of a loan. A city could misplace a death certificate. Bureaucracy skeleton. The filing cabinet didn't just store documents, it shaped institutions. By imposing structure on documents, it reinforced a way of thinking. That knowledge could be broken into categories. That facts could be accessed by indexing. That authority could be tracked through paper. The modern bureaucracy, whether a university, corporation, or state, relies on traceability. Every decision, form, policy, and letter needs to be written, filed, recalled. The cabinet made this possible. As Max Weber, the sociologist of bureaucracy, noted in the early 20th century, true authority lies not in charisma but in documents, in systems, in records. The filing cabinet was bureaucracy made metal. Cabinets in culture. Despite their boring exterior, filing cabinets entered the cultural imagination. In detective stories, clues are discovered in long-forgotten files. In spy films, cabinets hold secrets behind locked drawers. In comedies, cabinets overflow, fall over, or swallow unlucky workers whole. The cabinet is always the same. Heavy, mysterious, unyielding, a symbol of memory or the illusion of it. In literature and film, filing cabinets often stand for the past, forgotten, dusty, but waiting. What happens when a drawer is opened after 30 years? What will you find? The endless drawer. One of the most significant aspects of the filing cabinet was its promise of infinite expansion. Unlike ledgers, which had a fixed number of pages, or pigeonholes which had fixed compartments, the cabinet allowed new files to be added at any time, old ones to be removed, archived, or destroyed. Cross-referencing, duplicates, and parallel systems. This modularity was essential. In theory, any bureaucracy could grow forever, as long as there were more drawers. This led to a sense of institutional immortality. The paper might yellow, but the file would survive. The organization would remember. Unless, of course, it was misfiled. A pause in the drawer. And so a question. What does it mean to trust your memory to a drawer? To place a birth, a debt, a confession, a mistake into a folder, labeled and locked, and believe that someday someone will find it again. The filing cabinet is not just a box, it is a promise. That the past can be stored, that the future can be anticipated, and that the present can be organized. But can it? What happens when the key is lost, when the label fades, when the folder sticks? What if the drawer never opens again? You walk into an office building in the 1930s. The floor is linoleum, the windows tall and grimy, the lighting humming from overhead fixtures. Against the walls, and sometimes even in the middle of the room, stand long rows of filing cabinets, their gray metal faces identical, each one tagged with narrow rectangular labels. A, C, D, F, or tax forms 1921-1925. The space is not defined by desks or people. It is defined by storage. This is not merely where work is done, it's where work is remembered, where work resides. In this section, we'll explore how filing cabinets did more than store documents. They shaped how offices were built, how workers moved, and how minds were trained to think. The filing cabinet did not just contain bureaucracy. It became its architecture. The cabinet and the cubicle. As filing systems became standard, offices had to adapt physically. Open office layouts, common in the late 19th century, gave way to more partitioned spaces, not for privacy, but for record access. Records departments emerged, rooms devoted entirely to file cabinets. Corridors were designed with space for lateral access, so drawers could be pulled open without obstructing traffic. Fireproof vaults were installed to protect archives. Some large organizations built entire basements around record storage. Others built elevated floors, so drawers could be pulled without bending. In time, the filing cabinet and its spatial logic would give rise to the cubicle. The cubicle was not invented for comfort, but for containment, a modular structure that mirrored the modular logic of the cabinet. You too had your drawer. A system of systems. Filing encouraged systemic thinking. Everything had a place. Everything could be traced, retrieved, duplicated, and refiled. To function in such a world, workers had to adopt a cabineted mind. Thinking in categories. Working in sequences. Labeling everything names, dates, codes. Learning that what mattered was not just the content, but its place. A misfiled document, even a brilliant one, was as good as lost. The index card, an offshoot of the same logic, became the personal analog to the cabinet. It offered a portable filing method for ideas, notes, even books. Writers like Vladimir Nabokov and Walter Benjamin planned entire works on index cards, not as drafts, but as modular thoughts. Ideas, too, could be filed. Control, access, and permission. The cabinet was not open to all. Each drawer could be locked, restricted by department, monitored through checkout slips. File access became a symbol of status. The senior clerk had a key. The junior assistant had to ask. A manager's ability to retrieve File 7A, subsection 4, marked their power in the hierarchy. Information was no longer just something you knew. It was something you could locate. The act of knowing became the act of finding. The drawer replaced the memory, and the keyholder replaced the expert. Filing as emotional labor. Not all was cold control. For those who worked with cabinets daily, there was also feeling. Some clerks prided themselves on perfect files, precise tabs, crisp corners, no misalignments. Others dreaded the search for a missing folder, afraid that one lost paper might end a career. Some lived in fear of the drawer that jammed, the one file they could never open. Others found solace in routine, the daily rhythm of labels, folders, and boxes. A life among cabinets was a life of trust that the system would remember, anxiety that one misstep would ruin it, solitude, hours spent filing alone with paper and metal. To file something away was to put it to rest, and to hope it would sleep quietly until needed again. The cabinet and the machine. In time, filing logic influenced machine design. Early computers were imagined as mechanical clerks. Data was stored on punch cards, filed, indexed, stacked. The database was born as an electronic filing cabinet, retrievable not by drawer, but by command. Even the first software programs used folder metaphors. You opened a document. You saved it to a folder. You search by file name, not idea. We still speak of files, folders, and desktops, an office language inherited directly from the cabinet. The filing cabinet taught us to think like machines, even before machines could think. The invisible bureaucracy. Perhaps most fascinating is how filing systems became invisible. Once installed, cabinets faded into the background. You heard their metal clinks, saw their uniformity, but rarely questioned their logic. And yet, these were systems of power. Who could access a file? Who decided how it was labeled? Who had the authority to remove, redact, or shred? The filing cabinet gave organizations institutional memory. But memory, like all things, can be edited. In its neutrality, the cabinet gave cover to acts of omission, concealment, and erasure. The drawer closes, no one asks again. A question in the quiet. Today, we imagine our data to be fluid, searchable, cloud-based, automatic. But behind every spreadsheet, every PDF, every server, there is still the old logic. Of labels, of access, of trust in systems we cannot see. And so we ask, what was lost when we moved from the drawer to the screen? Was the act of touching paper, of filing by hand, of noticing a misplaced tab, a form of attention we no longer practice? And if so, what else might we be misfiling today? It is the early 2000s. A quiet office prepares for a renovation. Fluorescent lights hum, boxes sit half-packed, and along the back wall, a row of heavy gray filing cabinets stands untouched. They are dented from years of use, but still functional. Some drawers stick. One is labeled in fatting ink, Tax RECEIPTS 1978-1984. Someone opens a drawer. It is full. Folders packed tightly, yellowing papers, metal tabs with plastic labels that have begun to curl. A faint scent of dust and carbon paper escapes. No one has opened this drawer in 15 years. The information inside may already have been digitized, or it may have been lost in a server migration. But in this moment, it is still here, tangible, exact, resting in its original place. And so we begin the final part of this story, the slow disappearance of the filing cabinet and what we left behind in the drawers we no longer open. The digital shift. By the 1980s and 1990s, offices were undergoing transformation. Computers became standard equipment. Word processors replaced typewriters. Electronic storage first on floppy disks, then hard drives, then servers became more efficient and space-saving than paper. The promise was clear. A paperless office. No more filing cabinets. No more folders. No more rusted drawer handles or lost keys. Companies installed document management systems. Scanners replaced clerks. Filing rooms were emptied, repurposed, or closed off entirely. The dream was order without clutter, access without bulk, search without steps. But the reality proved more complex. The problem with paperless. Though digital files offered speed, they introduced new problems. Naming inconsistency. A file named Final Report V2 Real Ifinal, PDF, is less clear than a folder labeled Budget Review 2003. Version control. Paper has one version. Digital documents multiply which copy is correct, who edited it when. Loss of physical cues. In a cabinet you could remember where something was. Third drawer down, fourth folder from the back. Digital systems offer no spatial memory. Fragility. Files can be lost in a crash, or during migration, or to time itself trapped in formats no longer supported. Digital decay. Paper can last centuries, CDs degrade, hard drives crash, servers decommissioned, links break. The filing cabinet, for all its limitations, had a certain durability. You could see it, touch it, know it was there. The last clerks. As cabinets disappeared, so too did the people who knew how to use them. Filing clerks were laid off. Archives were consolidated. Document retention policies changed from decades to mere years. In some government offices, legacy cabinets still stand, but few remember how they're organized. Newer employees are unsure of how to retrieve files. The labels make little sense. The index card system has vanished. The institution forgets. Without the people, the cabinets become mausoleums of information intact, but inaccessible. A drawer that cannot be interpreted is a drawer full of silence. Memory, authority, and the illusion of search. Digital search has made information feel instantaneous, but it has also made it invisible. You don't know where a file lives. You don't see the folders it was nested within. You don't understand the system that holds it. You only ask and hope the algorithm finds it. This is a shift from filing to querying, from knowledge of systems to faith in search. And while this has benefits, it also removes something once fundamental. The sense that you could trace information through a system you understood. You used to walk to a cabinet, pull the drawer, find the folder, read the label, touch the paper. Now, you type a word and hope. The ghost in the drawer. Even in a digital world, the filing cabinet haunts us. Our interfaces still mimic it. Folders and subfolders. Labels and tabs. Trash cans and filing away functions. We still archive things. We still retrieve documents. We still organize files. We never truly left the drawer. We simply made it invisible. And perhaps that is the greatest risk, that we now trust systems we cannot see, cannot touch, and do not fully understand. Reflections in metal. Some offices keep old cabinets not for use, but for memory. A file no one dares destroy. A record that might one day be needed. A drawer someone cannot bring themselves to empty. Perhaps you've seen such a cabinet. Perhaps there's one in a library, a city hall basement, a law firm storage room. Silent, dusty, full. Not yet obsolete. Just waiting. And so we end with a thought. What happens to a society when it loses the thread of its own memory? Not through fire or flood, but through forgetting how it used to remember.